What happens when arrogance meets accountability and the world watches? Today, we bring you the shocking story of Marcus, a successful black passenger who faced public humiliation at 30,000 feet by a first-class pilot, and turned it into a lesson in courage, dignity, and justice. You won't believe how he handled the situation. Every word, every glance, every subtle act of prejudice is about to be exposed. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss stories that reveal the truth behind human courage and the fight against injustice. Now fasten your seatbelt, because this is not just a story about a flight. It's about standing up, speaking out, and showing the world that arrogance has consequences. He had no idea that a single flight would change everything. Captain Reynolds had flown for decades. His uniform was impeccable, his posture rigid with authority, and his reputation as a perfect pilot had been untouchable. He prided himself on order, on control, on maintaining the image of someone above questioning, and on this day, he thought nothing could challenge him. Then Marcus boarded. From the moment Marcus stepped into first class, Reynolds' gaze lingered. A subtle squint, a shift of his weight. Nothing overt, just enough to make the tension visible to the few who were paying attention. Marcus, a successful executive and a man who had earned every luxury he now enjoyed, noticed it immediately. He didn't react. Not yet. He smiled politely at the flight attendants, accepted his seat, and unfastened his briefcase. But the air was different, subtle, heavy, like walking into a room where the temperature suddenly dropped. Reynolds didn't attempt to hide his disdain. He muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the nearby attendant to hear, "Not sure he belongs here." The flight attendant glanced at Marcus, hesitated, then nodded stiffly at Reynolds. He didn't care. This was a routine for him. Humiliate quietly, assert superiority. Nothing personal. At least that's what he told himself. Marcus, however, had endured this before. Boardrooms, networking events, even family gatherings had sometimes treated him like an outsider. He was used to subtle prejudice, the kind that tried to make him doubt his worth. But this was different. This was first class. This was supposed to be earned, deserved, and untouchable. And yet, Reynolds' arrogance filled the cabin like a storm cloud. The first incident came within minutes. Marcus asked for assistance with storing his luggage. Reynolds, supervising the cabin, stepped forward with an air of superiority and a smirk. "I'll make sure it's handled. For you," he said, the emphasis on you dripping with condescension. Marcus kept his composure. He smiled politely and allowed the attendant to handle it. But the entire first-class cabin noticed the tension. Whispers from passengers, a slight stiffening in body language, subtle glances toward Marcus and the pilot. He thought he could control the narrative. He thought he could assert dominance with a single tone of voice, a smirk, a dismissive glance. He was wrong. Minutes later, Reynolds' arrogance escalated. As Marcus settled into his seat, he politely requested a glass of water. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "Water? Sure, if it's not too much trouble," he muttered, loud enough for Marcus to hear, a laugh hidden behind a cough. It was a small thing, but the humiliation was intentional. He wanted Marcus to feel out of place, to understand that in this space he was an intruder. Marcus, calm and poised, nodded and waited. But something inside him shifted. The patience that had carried him through countless slights in his life, the grace he had always shown in the face of disrespect, it began to simmer into resolve. He glanced around. Other passengers looked at him with curiosity, sensing tension but unsure why. Some pretended not to notice. Others leaned forward, watching silently, intrigued by the quiet storm unfolding in their midst. Reynolds continued. Every announcement over the intercom carried a subtle jab aimed at Marcus's section. "Please remain seated. We'll try to make everyone comfortable. Even those in the back, he said, exaggerating the caution in his voice. Marcus's jaw tightened. This wasn't just arrogance. It was bias, prejudice, and a deliberate attempt to humiliate him publicly. He could have ignored it. He could have stayed silent. But he didn't. Not tonight. Not this time. Marcus discreetly began documenting the interactions. His phone camera captured subtle smirks, clipped tones, and the small ways the pilot tried to assert dominance over him. Every whisper, every dismissive gesture, every subtle act of humiliation was recorded, not just for him, but for accountability. The tension in the cabin grew palpable. Reynolds didn't realize the effect he had on others. Passengers shifted uneasily. Flight attendants exchanged worried glances. The air felt heavy with expectation, anticipation, and silent judgment. Then came the tipping point. During a routine turbulence warning, Reynolds exaggerated the announcement when referencing Marcus's seat row. "Passengers in row 3, please. Ensure you are secure, especially those who may not be accustomed to first-class accommodations," he said, the emphasis sharp, cold, cruel. The cabin gasped. Some passengers exchanged looks of disbelief. Others whispered under their breath, "Did he really just say that?" Marcus remained composed. He took a deep breath, feeling every eye in the cabin on him. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was the focus of scrutiny, a quiet force against arrogance, bias, and humiliation. And then he made his move. He rose from his seat, calm, collected, and addressed the cabin in a measured voice that carried authority without anger. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to address something important. The interactions here have been disrespectful, not just to me, but to the principles of professionalism and equality that should guide every service, every business, and every interaction." Whispers spread. Passengers leaned in, intrigued. The crew froze, unsure how to respond. Reynolds's smirk faltered for the first time, a crack in his polished facade. Marcus continued, his voice steady. "Every action, every word, every look has been observed. And I have documentation. This is not about vengeance. It's about accountability. It's about dignity." A collective hush fell over the cabin. The power dynamic shifted instantly. Reynolds, the man who thought he controlled everything in this space, was suddenly exposed. The smug arrogance that had defined him for decades was gone, replaced by unease, defensiveness, and fear. The next moments were tense, electric. Passengers murmured, flight attendants subtly confirmed his statements, and Reynolds stumbled, unsure how to regain authority. Marcus's calm confidence contrasted sharply with the pilot's unraveling. For the first time, Marcus felt the satisfaction of turning humiliation into empowerment. He wasn't just defending himself. He was reclaiming space, dignity, and authority that had been denied to him through arrogance and prejudice. And in that moment, the cabin witnessed something extraordinary. The fall of an arrogant man who had underestimated the power of quiet strength, preparation, and unwavering self-respect. By the time the plane landed, word had already spread. The pilot's behavior, once hidden behind the sheen of authority and a uniform, was now documented, shared, and undeniable. What began as a routine flight had transformed into a story of accountability, courage, and public reckoning. Marcus stepped off the plane, calm, collected, and victorious. Not because he sought revenge, but because he had asserted his dignity in a world that often tries to deny it. The arrogant pilot's career, once untouchable, was about to meet its end. And all of it unfolded in the quiet courage, meticulous observation, and unshakable confidence of one man who refused to be humiliated. Marcus had always understood that life didn't hand out fairness. He knew that talent and hard work could be overlooked, that merit often took a back seat to prejudice, and that appearances often dictated opportunity far more than ability. Yet, he had never allowed bitterness to define him. At 34, Marcus had earned everything he had. He was a senior executive at a growing tech firm, a man who had started in entry-level positions, studied nights after grueling workdays, and taken every chance to learn, improve, and move forward. His family had been proud, his friends inspired, and his colleagues, for the most part, respected him. But there was always an invisible ceiling, a quiet, unspoken barrier he had to navigate at every turn. Flying first class had never been a matter of vanity. It was a reward for his persistence. For years he had saved, planned, and earned the privilege to travel in comfort, knowing that every seat represented a milestone of achievement. On this particular flight, he was heading home after a week of high-stakes meetings in New York, a week that culminated in a deal that could redefine his career. As he approached the jet bridge, Marcus felt a familiar mix of anticipation and caution. Boarding first class meant more than just comfort. It meant scrutiny. He had learned that higher status spaces often came with invisible hierarchies, places where behavior was judged not on merit, but on background, appearance, or race. And though he had navigated these dynamics countless times, the thought of it always stirred a tension deep in his chest. Captain Reynolds, the pilot in command, was a man whose reputation preceded him. He had flown for decades, known for his precision, for his unyielding insistence on order, and for a sense of superiority that seemed inseparable from his uniform. In his mind, first class was his domain, a place where he controlled not just the flight, but the behavior of everyone aboard. When Marcus stepped into the cabin, the subtle tension began immediately. Reynolds's gaze lingered longer than necessary, his eyes briefly scanning Marcus from head to toe before returning to paperwork. It was a small moment, almost imperceptible, but Marcus caught it. A flicker of disdain, a tightening of the jaw, a barely audible mutter under his breath. Not sure he belongs here. Marcus smiled politely at the flight attendants and the few passengers nearby. Calm, composed, unshaken. He knew better than to react impulsively, but his mind was already cataloging, observing, preparing. This was the start of an encounter that had the potential to become something far larger than a single flight. The initial moments passed with quiet tension. Marcus stowed his luggage, adjusted his seat, and opened his briefcase. He reviewed notes. For a meeting later in the week, sipping water and letting the hum of the cabin mask the subtle undercurrents of disdain from Reynolds. Yet the arrogance in the cabin was palpable. Small gestures, tiny slights, they added up. A smirk from Reynolds as he passed by, an exaggerated nod when Marcus asked a polite question, a slightly condescending tone in the intercom announcements. Nothing overt, nothing that could be formally reported yet, but enough to communicate a message. You do not belong here. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he studied the dynamics. Flight attendants glanced nervously at the pilot, unsure whether to intervene or ignore. Other passengers watched quietly, sensing tension but uncertain where it might lead. The air felt heavy, a mix of anticipation and subtle threat, as if the cabin itself were holding its breath. He had encountered bias before, of course. In corporate boardrooms, his ideas had been dismissed until repeated by someone else. Networking events often favored others with connections, glossing over his achievements. But this, the arrogance of someone entrusted with the safety and comfort of passengers, felt personal in a different way. It was public, visible, and auditable. And Marcus understood that he had a choice: endure quietly or confront it. As the flight progressed, Reynolds's subtle disdain escalated. He interjected in a minor service issue, offering unnecessary corrections to the attendants and throwing thinly veiled remarks at Marcus. We'll make sure everything is perfect, even for those who might not be accustomed to first-class standards, he said once, a smirk barely hidden behind a cough. Marcus noted everything, his mind cataloging incidents, gestures, tones, and behaviors. Each slight, though small in isolation, formed a pattern that could not be ignored, and he realized that this wasn't about him alone. It was about accountability, professionalism, and the broader message it sent to anyone watching. Yet even as tension built, Marcus remained composed. He engaged with the crew politely, made light conversation with neighboring passengers, and maintained the appearance of calm. But beneath the surface, determination simmered. He would not allow subtle humiliation to stand unchallenged. By mid-flight, the dynamics had shifted further. Reynolds began directing more pointed remarks at Marcus, testing his composure, almost daring him to react. One flight attendant approached Marcus discreetly, whispering, "I think he's targeting you." Marcus nodded slightly, understanding that any confrontation needed to be strategic, measured, and documented. He had learned long ago that impulsive reactions could backfire. Silence was not always weakness, and composure was not always compliance. With a quiet phone in his pocket, he began recording interactions subtly, capturing tone, gestures, and remarks that would serve as evidence if necessary. The passengers around him began to notice. Some exchanged glances, murmurs of concern, or curiosity passing quietly. Others, unaware of the subtleties, simply observed a man who remained calm despite a growing tension that seemed to pulse through the cabin. Marcus reflected on the irony. Here he was, in first class, a space that represented achievement and reward, yet feeling the sting of exclusion, condescension, and prejudice. It was a reminder that even spaces reserved for the successful could still harbor discrimination, subtle or overt, and that dignity often required courage to assert. Hours into the flight, Reynolds' actions escalated. He exaggerated instructions for turbulence, subtly singling out Marcus's row. "Passengers in row 3, please ensure you are secure, especially those who might not be used to first-class accommodations," he announced over the intercom. The emphasis cutting and personal, the cabin murmured. Marcus noted reactions. A young woman shifted uneasily, a businessman glanced up from his laptop, confused, and a flight attendant exchanged a concerned look with a colleague. Reynolds' attempt to assert superiority had become obvious, even to those unfamiliar with subtle prejudice. Marcus decided then that he would no longer wait. His patience, measured for years, had reached its limit, not in anger, but in determination. The first-class cabin, witnesses to arrogance and subtle humiliation, would also become witnesses to accountability. He rose from his seat, calm, composed, and deliberate. Every eye in the cabin turned toward him. He addressed the flight attendants first, then the passengers, then the pilot, his voice steady, resonant, and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I would like to address a situation that has unfolded during this flight. The interactions here, while perhaps subtle to some, have been disrespectful and unprofessional, not just to me, but to the principles of fairness and dignity that should guide every service and every professional environment." Whispers spread through the cabin. Passengers leaned forward. Crew members exchanged glances, some nodding in silent agreement. The energy shifted. What had begun as subtle humiliation transformed into tension and anticipation. Reynolds, taken aback, attempted to regain composure. His authority, once unchallenged, now wavered in the face of collective observation and documented evidence. Marcus continued, calmly outlining the behaviors he had documented, providing an account that was factual, precise, and undeniable. By the time the plane landed, the dynamic had shifted completely. The once arrogant pilot's power was exposed, fragile, and public. Passengers discussed the incident quietly, some recording, some sharing whispered impressions. Marcus had maintained his composure, asserted his dignity, and prepared the groundwork for accountability that would follow. Marcus sat in his seat, maintaining composure, yet the tension in first class thickened like fog. Every interaction from Captain Reynolds carried the subtle weight of disdain, but now the actions began to escalate into something more deliberate. Reynolds, emboldened by the silence of the cabin, began exercising his authority in ways designed to humiliate Marcus in public. It started with small, almost imperceptible acts. The flight attendants were given instructions with emphasis on Marcus's section. "Make sure the passengers in row 3 have everything thoroughly," Reynolds would say, undercutting Marcus's calm demeanor with a tone that implied incompetence. Each slight was a test, a probe into Marcus's patience, and the captain observed carefully for any sign of reaction. Marcus had learned to read such behavior over the years. Every smirk, every word clipped too sharply, every condescending glance told a story. He understood what Reynolds was attempting: to unsettle him, to provoke a visible reaction, to reaffirm the pilot's sense of superiority. But Marcus remained silent, counting, recording, and observing. His phone, hidden in his lap, captured each moment discreetly. Other passengers began to notice the shift in energy. A woman near the window leaned forward and whispered to her companion, "Did you see that? He's treating him differently." A businessman glanced over his laptop screen, frowning, while a young couple exchanged uneasy looks. The cabin was aware, but most were powerless to intervene, until Marcus decided to act. The first major incident came during the in-flight meal service. Marcus politely requested a glass of water, and Reynolds, who had been observing the cabin from the cockpit entrance, interjected with a smirk, "We'll get to that, if it's not too difficult, of course." The flight attendant froze for a split second, caught between authority and courtesy. Marcus, unflinching, nodded and waited. The subtle humiliation was deliberate. Reynolds wanted the passengers to see the superiority of the pilot over someone he considered beneath him. As the plane leveled out, Reynolds continued. His announcements over the intercom began carrying a patronizing tone. "Passengers in first class, please make sure you are seated comfortably, especially those who might not be used to this level of service." The words were calculated, the delivery precise. His eyes flicked to Marcus as he spoke, and a small group of passengers began whispering, their curiosity mixed with discomfort. Marcus realized that Reynolds' arrogance wasn't random, it was strategic. Each public slight was designed to provoke, to assert dominance, and to make Marcus appear out of place. But Marcus, calm and poised, began planning his response. Every gesture, every glance, and every word was being catalogued. He was preparing for a confrontation that would not just defend his dignity, but expose the pilot's behavior to the world. The tension escalated during a turbulence announcement. Reynolds overemphasized the importance of seatbelts, singling out Marcus's row. "Passengers in row 3, please ensure your belts are fastened securely, especially if this is new to you." The statement carried a laughable undertone of mockery. Passengers looked around, shocked at the unnecessary condescension. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained seated, silent, gathering his composure. Minutes later, Reynolds made another deliberate move. He walked past Marcus's seat, leaning slightly, and muttered under his breath, audible enough for Marcus to hear, "Not sure you're fit for first class." He smirked and walked away, leaving the cabin in an uncomfortable hush. Marcus's eyes followed him, but he said nothing. Instead, he discreetly captured the interaction on his phone. The subtle harassment became relentless. Reynolds began monitoring Marcus's requests personally, intervening whenever possible. A menu question, a request for a blanket, even a glance in his direction was met with patronizing commentary. Marcus observed everything, noting the pattern and timing. Every act was a deliberate attempt to assert dominance over someone he perceived as inferior. As the flight continued, passengers began to sense the tension. Whispered conversations filled the cabin. Some passengers looked on in discomfort, unsure of whether to intervene. Others observed quietly, fascinated by the unfolding dynamic. Marcus felt the eyes, not as intimidation, but as silent witnesses, strengthening his resolve. Marcus realized that this was no longer just about a single act of disrespect. It was a system of microaggressions, bias, and entitlement displayed publicly in the confined space of the cabin. Every passenger was now a witness. Every gesture of arrogance was being recorded, not just mentally, but digitally. The situation had evolved from a minor conflict to a public accountability moment. Reynolds' next act of deliberate humiliation came when he returned to the cabin for a routine safety check. He approached Marcus's seat, clipboard in hand, and scrutinized him with an exaggerated frown. "Sir, you may want to familiarize yourself with our safety instructions. It's important to understand first-class protocol," he said, the smirk returning as he glanced at nearby passengers. Marcus responded, polite but firm. "Thank you. I've reviewed the materials thoroughly, as safety is always a priority." His tone was calm, confident, and measured, precisely what Reynolds hoped he would not be. The captain's smirk faltered for a brief moment, a crack in his carefully maintained facade. The passengers began whispering again. Some pulled out their phones, capturing moments. A subtle energy shifted in the cabin. The power dynamic, once dominated entirely by Reynolds, began to shift under the weight of collective observation. Later, during a minor delay in the service of drinks, Reynolds's arrogance escalated further. He approached the flight attendants, instructing them on how to handle Marcus's requests with unnecessary precision. "Make sure his drink is perfect. He deserves it. But let's not make it too easy for him," he muttered. The comment, casual to some, was a direct slight to Marcus. Marcus remained composed. He nodded politely to the attendants, maintaining his demeanor. But internally, he recognized that the escalation had reached a critical point. Reynolds was not just arrogant, he was reckless, publicly displaying behavior that could no longer be ignored. Marcus realized that a confrontation was inevitable, one that would expose the pilot's bias, protect his dignity, and potentially alter the course of the flight. The tension built further when a passenger whispered to Marcus, concerned, "About Reynolds' behavior. Do you want me to say something?" the woman asked quietly. Marcus smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "Just watch." His calm response was not arrogance, it was strategic. He understood that any misstep could backfire. He needed evidence, witnesses, and composure. Reynolds, sensing the rising tension, made one final deliberate act of condescension. He walked past Marcus's seat again, pausing slightly. "I hope you're comfortable, sir. We wouldn't want any mistakes. First class is for those who truly belong," he said, his smirk broad and confident. The cabin fell silent. Marcus, seated, eyes steady, felt a wave of resolve. This was the moment. The subtle harassment, the microaggressions, the public humiliation, it had all led to this point. He would not react with anger. He would react with dignity, clarity, and undeniable truth. Marcus discreetly reviewed his recordings. Every slight, every condescending word, every smirk, captured. Every act of bias had been documented. The passengers were now witnesses, ready to affirm the reality of what had unfolded. The power dynamic in the cabin, carefully maintained by Reynolds, was beginning to crumble. The first major confrontation was imminent. Marcus stood slowly, ensuring that all eyes were on him, not with anger, but with calm authority. The whispers intensified. Flight attendants exchanged glances, nodding subtly, silently supporting him. Other passengers leaned forward, captivated by the tension and suspense. Marcus began to speak, his voice steady, clear, and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to address an ongoing situation during this flight. What has occurred here is not simply a matter of personal preference or opinion. It is a matter of professionalism, dignity, and respect. The interactions I have experienced have been disrespectful, and I have documented them for clarity and accountability." The cabin fell silent. Passengers and crew alike were fully engaged. Reynolds, initially smirking, now looked uncertain, realizing that his attempts to dominate the cabin had failed. The arrogance that had defined him for decades was being challenged. in the most public way possible. Whispers and murmurs spread. Phones were discreetly raised, recording. The energy in the cabin had shifted entirely. Marcus had transformed from a passive target of harassment into a central figure of authority, commanding attention not through force, but through composure, truth, and preparation. Reynolds attempted to interject, but his voice faltered. The cabin, now fully aware of the dynamics, did not respond. Passengers leaned forward, flight attendants nodded subtly, and the pilot's authority began to erode under the weight of scrutiny. By the midpoint of the flight, Marcus's strategy was clear. He was not merely defending his dignity, he was exposing systemic arrogance and bias. Every act of disrespect, every subtle humiliation, every microaggression was now a piece of undeniable evidence. The cabin had transformed from a theater of humiliation into a stage of accountability. As the flight continued, Reynolds's behavior grew more desperate. Each attempt to regain authority was met with subtle resistance. The flight attendant's compliance carried quiet disapproval, passengers' eyes held silent judgment, and Marcus remained composed, calm, and resolute. The rising tension reached a point where the confrontation could no longer be delayed. Marcus, fully aware of the stakes, was prepared to address the situation publicly, ensuring that every act of bias and arrogance was visible, documented, and undeniable. The air in first class was electric. Every passenger, every crew member, every subtle hum of the engine seemed to pause, anticipating what was about to happen. Marcus sat for a moment, letting the weight of the previous hours sink in. The small acts of humiliation, the condescending smirks, the thinly veiled remarks, they had all led to this. He could no longer remain silent. The pilot, Captain Reynolds, believed he still held absolute authority, but Marcus knew the power dynamic had shifted. He wasn't reacting impulsively. He was precise, deliberate, and fully aware of every eye upon him. Reynolds, pacing near the cockpit door, glanced at Marcus. His smirk had faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. Something in Marcus's calm, measured posture unsettled him. The passengers, many of whom had observed the microaggressions, were whispering now. Phones were subtly raised, recording. Reynolds could feel the tide turning. Marcus rose slowly, deliberately, ensuring that his movements drew attention without aggression. He locked eyes with the pilot and spoke, his voice steady but carrying authority. "Captain Reynolds," he began. "I want to address the behavior you have exhibited during this flight. The interactions I have experienced are not isolated or accidental. They are deliberate and they are disrespectful." The cabin went silent. Flight attendants exchanged subtle glances, nodding. Other passengers leaned forward, fully aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Reynolds' smirk faltered. Marcus continued, his voice calm, unwavering. "You have made comments, gestures, and announcements designed to humiliate me in front of others. Every word, every tone, every act has been deliberate. I have recorded them, not to shame you personally, but to ensure accountability. This is about professionalism, dignity, and respect, not just for me, but for everyone who witnesses or experiences such behavior." Reynolds opened his mouth to interject, but faltered. His usual arrogance could not withstand the clarity, composure, and evidence Marcus presented. A murmured whisper spread through the cabin. One passenger said quietly, "He's telling the truth. We all saw it." Another passenger subtly nodded, raising their phone to record. The shift was tangible. The pilot's authority, once absolute, was now fragile. Marcus took a deliberate step closer, maintaining eye contact. "This is not personal," he said. "But what you have done is unacceptable. I am asking for respect. I am asking for accountability. And I am asking the crew and the passengers here to acknowledge what has occurred." For a moment, Reynolds froze. The air was thick with tension. Every passenger in first class could feel it. The once commanding pilot was exposed, vulnerable, and unsure. The climax came in the form of undeniable validation. Flight attendants, previously hesitant to speak, nodded subtly, affirming Marcus's account. Passengers whispered their agreement, some even recording the moment. Reynolds's face went pale. His composure, which had never faltered in decades, was cracking under the weight of collective observation. Marcus, sensing the shift, pressed forward. Every action, every condescending remark, every attempt to assert superiority at my expense has been witnessed, and now it is public knowledge. This is a reminder that authority is not absolute when wielded without integrity. The murmurs grew louder. Phones clicked. The cabin had become a courtroom, and Marcus was presenting the evidence with unwavering poise. Reynolds could feel his career slipping through his fingers. He opened his mouth again, trying to regain control. "Sir, you are out of line," he barked. Marcus's response was calm, measured, and final. "Out of line? No. I am simply asserting my right to be treated with the same dignity afforded to every passenger. Your conduct has violated that principle. Your arrogance, your bias, and your deliberate humiliation will not go unchallenged. The passengers and crew here have seen it. I have recorded it, and your behavior will be reviewed." The cabin went silent, the gravity of the words sinking in. Reynolds's face flushed. He realized that his reputation, built on decades of authority, was unraveling. Every passenger had witnessed the imbalance of power, and every smartphone captured his humiliation. The tension reached its peak as Marcus lowered his gaze briefly, then met Reynolds' eyes with unwavering resolve. "This is your moment of accountability," he said softly but firmly. "And the world will know what has occurred here today." Passengers began whispering, nodding, some applauding quietly. The shift in energy was undeniable. Reynolds, who had expected submission, had instead been confronted with truth, dignity, and unwavering courage. In that moment, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and empowerment. The hours of subtle harassment, microaggressions, and public humiliation had culminated. In a turning point, he had maintained his composure, documented the evidence, and now held the undeniable moral high ground. Reynolds, once untouchable in his position, could no longer control the narrative. His attempts at authority had crumbled under the scrutiny of witnesses, documentation, and Marcus's unwavering courage. As the flight neared its descent, Marcus remained seated, composed, and dignified. He had not shouted. He had not reacted with anger. But he had ensured that the arrogance and bias of the pilot had been exposed fully, publicly, and irrevocably. The climax was complete. Marcus had turned humiliation into empowerment. The pilot, whose career had been built on control and authority, was now vulnerable, exposed, and accountable. The passengers and crew had witnessed the unmasking of arrogance and prejudice. Marcus's actions had not only defended his dignity, but set a precedent. Authority, no matter how established, could be challenged with composure, evidence, and moral clarity. Arrogance and bias, no matter how subtle, could no longer hide behind uniforms, titles, or traditions. As the plane touched down, the tension in the cabin dissipated. Passengers murmured among themselves, some expressing quiet admiration. Flight. Attendants exchanged satisfied glances. Marcus's expression remained calm, but inside he felt a surge of accomplishment. He had faced deliberate humiliation, bias, and arrogance, and had turned it into a moment of undeniable truth. Reynolds, for the first time in decades, was confronted with the consequences of his actions. The pilot's smirk, once confident and untouchable, had vanished, replaced with the pale realization that his career and the respect he had taken for granted was now in jeopardy. The climax ended not with confrontation alone, but with a profound shift in power, perception, and accountability. Marcus had achieved something far greater than personal vindication. He had demonstrated that courage, composure, and evidence could expose even the most deeply entrenched arrogance. The passengers and crew would never forget this flight, and neither would Reynolds. The plane's wheels touched the tarmac with a subtle jolt, but for Marcus the impact was almost imperceptible. The flight was over, but the story that had unfolded in the confined, high-stakes first-class cabin would echo far beyond the jet's walls. Every passenger had witnessed the unraveling of arrogance, and every smartphone had recorded the moment when authority and prejudice were confronted head-on. As Marcus gathered his belongings, the energy in the cabin had shifted completely. The Aid whispers were no longer tentative. They were filled with admiration and validation. Passengers offered quiet congratulations, some shaking his hand, others nodding with respect. Flight attendants, who had been caught between loyalty to protocol and the injustice unfolding, subtly expressed relief and approval. Captain Reynolds, once untouchable, slunk toward the cockpit door, his face pale, jaw tight, and confidence eroded. The arrogance that had defined him for decades had collapsed in minutes. Marcus's composed confrontation had exposed the systematic humiliation, the condescending gestures, and the subtle bias in ways that were impossible to dismiss. Back on the ground, the consequences began almost immediately. The airline's corporate office had been alerted by multiple passengers, many submitting the recordings Marcus had discreetly captured. Within hours, internal investigations were launched. Reynolds' actions, previously hidden under the guise of authority and routine, were now fully documented and undeniable. Marcus, for his part, remained composed. He didn't seek revenge or personal glory. His goal had always been accountability and dignity, not spectacle. But the outcome had far-reaching implications. The pilot, whose career had rested on the perception of professionalism and control, now faced suspension, public scrutiny, and an internal review that would determine whether he retained his position. The story quickly spread beyond the airline. Social media channels buzzed with clips of the incident, passengers sharing videos, and commentators discussing the broader implications of arrogance, bias, and the consequences of unchecked authority. Marcus's calm, measured response became an example of how dignity and composure could confront systemic prejudice without aggression. Meanwhile, Marcus reflected privately on the flight. He had faced deliberate humiliation, subtle microaggressions, and public condescension. But through careful observation, documentation, and unwavering composure, he had turned what could have been a moment of defeat into one of empowerment. He realized that courage was not always loud or combative. It could be quiet, deliberate, and backed by evidence. The airline's investigation concluded that Reynolds' behavior violated professional standards and codes of conduct. He was removed from flight duty pending review and placed under strict supervision. Internal training protocols were revised to include stronger emphasis on equality, professionalism, and accountability. The ripple effect of one passenger's courage prompted institutional change. Passengers who had witnessed the event firsthand reached out to Marcus in the days following. Emails, messages, and social media posts poured in, many expressing admiration for his courage and composure. One young passenger wrote, "I've never seen someone handle disrespect with such calm and strength. You taught me how to stand up for myself without losing dignity." For Marcus, the personal impact was equally profound. He had always understood that microaggressions and subtle prejudice were pervasive, but rarely so publicly visible. This experience reinforced his belief in preparation, strategic thinking, and the power of moral clarity. By documenting each act, remaining calm, and speaking decisively at the right moment, he had achieved not just personal vindication, but also systemic accountability. The resolution also brought a broader lesson about the dangers of arrogance and bias. Reynolds had relied on the assumption that authority, uniform, and decades of unchallenged experience would shield him from accountability. He underestimated the power of truth, dignity, and witnesses. His career, once secure, now hung in the balance because he failed to recognize the human cost of prejudice. Marcus's actions became a case study in leadership, courage, and ethical confrontation. Corporate trainers used his approach to illustrate how to address bias in professional settings without aggression but with clarity and evidence. Social commentators highlighted the broader implications. Power and authority are only sustainable when exercised responsibly, and arrogance at the expense of others ultimately leads to downfall. On a personal level, Marcus felt a quiet sense of triumph. He had faced deliberate public humiliation and turned it into an opportunity to assert dignity, demand accountability, and demonstrate courage. The experience reinforced his confidence in himself, his values, and his ability to navigate situations of prejudice without losing composure. The flight, which began as a routine journey, had transformed into a defining moment in Marcus's life. It was a testament to the fact that courage and integrity can disrupt even the most entrenched systems of arrogance and bias. The first-class cabin, a symbol of achievement and privilege, had become the stage for a demonstration of moral strength and human dignity. In the weeks that followed, Marcus continued to reflect on the broader societal lessons. He realized that prejudice, when left unchecked, can manifest anywhere, even in spaces assumed to be safe or prestigious. The incident underscored the importance of vigilance, preparation, and the willingness to confront injustice when it arises. Ultimately, the resolution of the story was not just about one pilot's career or one passenger's dignity. It was about accountability, institutional change, and the enduring power of courage. Marcus had transformed humiliation into empowerment, bias into awareness, and prejudice into an opportunity for systemic reflection. The final moments of resolution were marked by quiet acknowledgement. Passengers disembarked with a renewed sense of awareness. Flight attendants felt empowered to act against injustice in the future, and Marcus walked off the plane with his head held high, knowing that he had done more than defend himself. He had sparked a chain of accountability and reflection that would extend far beyond a single flight. As the airport lights glinted on the tarmac, Marcus understood the full impact of the day. Racism and prejudice, subtle or overt, can damage lives, undermine trust, and corrupt institutions. But dignity, preparation, and courage can not only counteract such behavior, but also inspire systemic change. His actions had proven that even in the face of deliberate humiliation, one person can confront bias with composure, evidence, and integrity, and emerge not just victorious, but transformative. The story concluded not with vengeance, but with triumph. Triumph grounded in morality, human dignity, and the undeniable power of standing up against injustice. Marcus's journey reminded the world that courage does not require aggression, that integrity can challenge authority, and that even the smallest acts of preparation and composure can have the most profound consequences.